Hi, and welcome to Enchantment of Eternity's book to show comparison for the Expanse Season 3, Episode 5, Triple Point. This video is part of a series of videos where I compare the Expanse TV show to that of its source material, pointing out the differences and giving my opinion on how well these adaptations work. So I have to start with a spoiler warning for the Expanse up to the end of Season 3. If you haven't seen up to this point, you may not want to watch this video, otherwise some things may be spoiled for you. However, there will be no spoilers from the novels beyond Season 3. If you haven't read the books and only seen up to Season 3, do not worry, this video will be free from future spoilers. So our episode begins on the Versanote as they are en route to Io. Bobby points out that there are a lot of ships out there because of the war, so it will be hard to get by undetected. But Alex points out that most of the ships are headed to Callisto, where Mars has a major military base, so he found a route where they can slip by to Io undetected. Holden notes that whoever's on Io will be able to detect them there, but there's nothing they can do about it, so he brings up schematics of the structure and points out plans to penetrate the base and look for the missing children. And we also see shots of Avasarala watching the news about the protomolecule on Venus, and Prax gearing up by loading a gun. Now, in the novels, the situation was a bit different. As I mentioned in previous videos, at this stage, Versanote had joined forces with a Martian fleet, and while they were en route to Io, Avasarala contacted Secretary General Gillis directly to warn him about Ehrenreich and the conspiracy to use the protomolecule hybrids to destroy Mars. At which case Gillis officially announced an investigation into the matter, which really meant that they were going after Ehrenreich and Admiral Nguyen. So Admiral Suller and his fleet joined up with the Versanote and the Martian fleet to form a super fleet who were all heading to Io together. However, Admiral Nguyen and his fleet was already orbiting Io at this time, so they were waiting for them there. So there was no plan to slip by to Io undetected, as they were that simply wasn't going to happen. And at this stage, they weren't really planning a ground assault on Io because the first step was to get by Admiral Nguyen and his fleet that were blocking Io, so that was where more of the strategic thinking lay. Avasarala was confident because their combined fleet was twice the size of Nguyen's fleet, but Holden wasn't as confident because he wasn't sure Suller's forces could be trusted not to switch sides or withhold their help once Mars started shooting at UNN ships. I think I prefer the situation in the novels of there being two huge fleets about to clash over Io, over the Versanote silently trying to slip by. It seems a bit more intense to me, and also it gave Avasarala more to do in terms of mobilizing support, so I'm going to give this a -2. So next we go over to the MCRN ship, the Himurabi, where Ensign Snopoli, one of the Martians that the Versanote rescued in the previous episode, got picked up by. We see Snopoli taken to the MCR captain, with Captain Trinino and her XO Lieutenant Durant. There, Snopoli explains to them that he and his team were rescued by James Holden and that Bobby Draper and Christian Avasarala were also on board, something that Trinino and Durant find hard to believe, but Snopoli simply insists that they were there. So Durant asks why they let him go, and Snopoli responds in order to deliver a message. So he then plays the message from Ehrenreich that incriminates him, but Trinino and Durant are still suspicious. Durant even suggests that it might be counterintelligence. Snopoli relays Avasarala's request to transmit the message to Admiral Suller, but Crenino refuses, saying that he is an enemy combatant in a time of war, and moreover, he's destroyed quite a few of their ships. Captain Crenino then inquires about where Suller is, and the helmsman reports the Agatha King is en route to Io, which confuses them as Durant states there's nothing on Io but volcanic ash and stink. Crenino then orders that the MCRN be informed that they gathered intel that the Agatha King is headed to Io, probably for some unknown purpose to help in the war effort, so they are going to pursue them. When Snopoli asks again about the message, Crenino dismisses him, and that seems to be the end of that. So in the novels, we got nothing like this. As I mentioned in the previous video, Sinopoli and his crew weren't in the novels, and they were just invented for the show. But I believe Captain Cornetto and Lieutenant Durant were also not in the novels. Although there was a Martian fleet headed to Io, but as I stated, they were with the Versanote, so they already knew about the protomolecule hybrids, and Souther already joined forces with them, so there wasn't a dilemma there. But I think this storyline and these characters work for the situation established in the show, and I think the actor who played Cornetto did an outstanding job, and overall, this all raises the stakes on how Mars will react, and this impacts what will happen to Souther, which I think makes this all a bit more interesting, so I'm going to give this a +2. So then we go over to the Agatha King, where Lieutenant Mancuso and Lieutenant Schaefer are informing Admiral Nguyen, who is now in command, about the changing course of the Martian battleship, the Himurabi, that is now going towards Io, chasing after them, and they recommend that they change course to rendezvous with the fleet near Callisto for safety. But Nguyen denies the recommendation, saying that they're going to Io, and instead orders that the UN fleet be diverted to join them there. When Admiral Souther asks why they're going to Io, Nguyen simply answers that he doesn't need to know. When they protest further, Nguyen shuts down the argument, saying simply that they are going to Io. He then informs Souther that unless he has specific business there, that there is no need for him to be on the CIC. So in the novels, the situation was quite different. As I just mentioned, Souther and Nguyen were not on the same ship, and instead, each in command of their own fleet. Nguyen's fleet was already at Io, presumably to assume control of the protomolecule hybrids and to protect them from the combined fleet that was consisted of the Versanote Martian fleet and Admiral Souther's fleet, which were on their way to stop the protomolecule hybrid project. So those involved were already very much aware of what was going on. However, the show does have something interesting by placing all the main characters on one ship and creating some new characters such as Souther's lieutenants and Nguyen's Lieutenant Boyer. It creates a new dynamic that really internalizes rather than externalizes the conflict within the UN, and I think this scene is a great setup for that, so I'm going to give it a +1. So next we go to the Versanote, where while Holden is getting coffee, Avasarala comes to talk to him and starts by telling the story of the statue of Atlas that her father had when she was a child and how it reminds her never to quit. Holden figures out where she's going with this, and then she reveals that she does in fact want a sample of the protomolecule, but says it's for the betterment of all of the human race, and not just Earth. That Jules Pierre Mal has been letting the children play in the backyard while he sorts out whatever god or monster looms over the fence, and that she and Holden are adults and it's time that he starts acting like one. But Holden says he tried saving the world, and all he did was make things worse. So nothing like this happened in the novels. As I mentioned in the previous video, Avasarala and I never tried nor wanted to get a sample of the protomolecule. And I believe the fact that she does here kind of goes against her character. Now, they do try to justify it in the scene by having her intention to be good, but I still don't see how this character beat was necessary, especially consider how it was actually never followed up on in any way in the show. I see what they were going for when Avasarala says that she's moved past her Earth must come first mentality. It's supposed to show that she's grown as a character, but I think wanting a sample of the protomolecule isn't the best way to do that. Honestly, I feel the different dynamic they established in the show left Avasarala with nothing to do, whereas in the books at this stage in the story, she was very important and had a lot to do, and this scene is just trying to give her something to do, and I think is a huge downside to the show's version of events, so I'm going to give this a -3. So then we get a scene with Alex in the command center as he turns on the comms briefly so he can track the MCRN and UNN fleets to make sure that the coast is still clear, which it is, but when he does so, he notices a message for him. He plays it, and it's from his son, who says that unlike his mom, he's not mad at him, and he understands what Alex is doing, and says that he wants to grow up to be like him and fight for Mars as well, and that he's proud to be his son. And this, of course, makes Alex feel all better. So this scene is a follow-up to the scene in the previous episode where Alex's wife said she didn't want him in their lives anymore, and it was a good follow-up. However, in the novels, none of this happened, as Alex didn't even have a son and was already divorced at this stage. Although it should be noted that when talking to Bobby Draper, Avasarala casually mentioned that Alex Kamal had a son that he didn't know about, but this was never followed up on in any significant way. Yet, still interesting, she knew more about him than he knew about himself. Anyway, that was a good scene to help flesh out Alex's character more, so I'm going to give this a +1. So then we see Amos teaching Prax how to use a gun as they target practice. Probably not a bad idea after how much he messed up after they gave him a gun last time. Prax thanks Amos for helping him, but Amos says that he can thank him when they get his daughter back, but Prax amends, or if they get even, as that's the next best thing. And Amos is obviously disturbed by this change in Prax, as it's clear that he's given up hope and already is turning towards revenge. Now, there's nothing like this in the novels. As I mentioned earlier, the show does a lot more to establish the Amos and Prax relationship, and Amos never taught Prax how to fire a gun, but when I think about it, it makes a lot of sense that he would, as in the novels, they give Prax a gun and let him go to Io to help retrieve May, which seems out of character for Holden, as he was very much against giving Prax a gun after what he did on Ganymede that almost got them all killed. Add to that, when the combined fleet clashed with Nguyen's fleet and a Martian captain threatened to completely slag Io, Prax lost his shit in the command center and started freaking out at Avasarala to do something, to the point where Holden tackled him and had him sedated and locked in his quarters. So it seems odd that shortly after that he would just give Prax a gun and let him go to Io, where here it makes a lot more sense that Amos has been training Prax since Ganymede and now knows better how to conduct himself. So I think the show really improved on this and set up a better dynamic for Prax going to Io, so I'll give this a +2. So then we go back to the Agatha King, where Admiral Souther is having lunch in the mess hall when his lieutenants Schaefer and Mancuso approach him. They tell him that they are very suspicious of Admiral Nguyen's behavior and how he diverted the fleet to an abandoned moon for some unknown reason, and also relieved Souther of command for no good reason, and that they have been talking with other ships in the fleet that support him and feel the same way about Nguyen. They tell him that if he were to make a move, these ships would support him. Souther doesn't sound too pleased with the sound of a move and gets up and leaves. Now, what's interesting is that in the novel, Souther's lieutenants didn't have to gather support amongst the fleet. Souther already had his own fleet, as did Admiral Nguyen. In fact, it leads me to believe that the entire structure of the UNN is a bit different in the novels, as it seems they had a dynamic that was a bit more fractured, and each admiral acted as the leader of their own faction, even though that they all took orders from the same man. For example, Souther doesn't actually move against Admiral Nguyen until Gillis gives the okay, and if Gillis ordered him to go after the Versanote, he would do it. But still, the admirals still seem to be in control somewhat of their own little factions. However, this scene works very well for what was established in the show, and in fact was great in building the tension for what is about to come. It's also more in line with how Souther has been portrayed in the show, which is a bit different than the novels, where in the show he's honorable to a fault, kind of like Ned Stark in Game of Thrones, where he quits as fleet commander because he was against the aggression on Mars, but because he quit, they put Nguyen in charge, and Nguyen is now in a position to have more power over him, which is coming back to bite him on the ass now. Whereas in the books, Nguyen and Souther were equal in power, they just each commanded their own fleet. Anyway, I like this scene, so I want to give it a +2. So then Admiral Nguyen's Lieutenant Boyer steps into the mess hall after Suller leaves, and Lieutenant Schaefer begins to antagonize him by telling him that his boss is a bit of a prick. When Boyers defends him, he says that he was good enough to become fleet commander, and Schaefer retorts that it's only because Suller stepped down. Boyers then tells a story about how Admiral Nguyen was in a famous battle with the Martians and was on a ship that was heavily damaged, where he saw over 20 men instantly killed, and since then holds a grudge against Mars. Boyer finishes by saying that he's glad Nguyen is in command in a time like this. Now, none of these characters in the scene existed in the books. This also establishes Admiral Nguyen has quite a different character from his book counterpart as well, as the book version of Nguyen was a bit more of a political opportunist who was all bark. Avasarala would often refer to him as a small little man, and I believe she would also question the size of his manhood, while Show Nguyen is more of a grief-stricken badass with an axe to grind against Mars. It makes Nguyen more relatable and more understandable, but still the obvious villain of the story who's doing the wrong thing, but you understand his motivation more, which to me only makes him a more dynamic character, so I'm going to give this a +3. So then we go back to the Versanote, where we see Bobby Draper preparing her battle suit, trying to stock up on ammo, but the Versanote supplies are barely adequate. Alex is there trying to help, and Draper asks him about how they managed to kill a protomolecule hybrid. Alex explains how they lured it out of the ship and then torched it with the Versanote's drive. Draper then deduces she needs high incendiaries, and she finds enough of them, and if she fires enough of them at it, it should do the trick. But Alex is concerned. He reminds her that the plan is that if they see any of those things, they run, and Draper simply responds by saying, "I know the plan." So in the novels, Holden actually had the idea to ask a Martian ship for the supplies that Draper needed for her battle suit, and he gave her these supplies as a surprise gift, one that she really appreciated, as it gave her more than enough supplies to get her battle suit ready to take on a hybrid, which Holden was totally okay with, as they didn't want to take on the hybrid, but if they had to, they knew it was better to be prepared, which is quite in contrast to the scene where the Versanote supplies are barely adequate, which I suppose makes sense, as in the show they have no Martian escorts, and without the Martian escorts they wouldn't be able to resupply. It does mean in the show Bobby Draper wasn't as equipped to take on the hybrid as her book counterpart, but it doesn't seem to affect the story at all when she does confront it, but ultimately I'm fine with that. I thought this was a nice little scene that worked just as well as it did in the books, so I'm going to give this a 0. So then we go to Io, where Dr. Strickland and Jules Pierre Mal are overlooking Katoa, who is now in the advanced stages in his turn into a protomolecule hybrid. Mal tries to interrogate Katoa for more information on the protomolecule and what it's up to, but he makes vague references to how disassembling things helps them understand them more, and then says that you can't stop the work. Mal latches on to the talk about the work and asks more about it, but Katoa is mostly incoherent, where Mal mostly gleams that the protomolecule is building or creating something, but he still has no idea what that may be. But Katoa gets out of it because he's turning into a hybrid too fast, so Strickland gives him something to slow his transformation. Now, needless to say, this wasn't in the novels at all, but it is interesting that Katoa mentions that you can't stop the work, which is also what Julie Mal said after she had transformed into a protomolecule version of herself. However, in the novels, we never got anyone actually trying to communicate with the protomolecule to find out what it's up to, which is actually a pretty good idea and an interesting story concept that I think adds a lot of flavor to the story, so I'm going to give this a +2. So then we go back to the Agatha King, where we see they are approaching Io when Lieutenant Mancuso receives a message from the MCRN Karakun addressed specifically to Admiral Souther. He discreetly tells Lieutenant Schaefer about it, who orders him to erase the comm logs, and then she shows the message to Admiral Souther. And it is, of course, the incriminating recording of Aaron Wright, where he admits to everything. However, upon seeing it, Souther tells Schaefer that he needs to confirm this first, and when she asks what he wants her to do, he simply says, "Be ready for anything." Souther then goes to see Cotillard, but when a guard blocks his way into the med bay, instead of trying to sneak in like he did last time, he simply tells the guard to get the fuck out of his way, and he does. Souther then asks Cotillard what the message from Aaron Wright says, and when he confirms the basic message, Souther then asks specifically what Martian ship did Aaron Wright say he destroyed, and Cotillard responds with the correct answer, confirming for him that the message is indeed authentic. But then Lieutenant Boyers charges into the room with several armed security demanding that Souther report to the bridge where Admiral Nguyen wants to see him. So as I said, none of this occurred in the novels, as Souther and Nguyen were not on the same ship together, and the whole incriminating message from Aaron Wright wasn't really a thing. However, in this scene, Souther makes a fatal flaw, kind of like what Ned Stark did in Game of Thrones, when Schaefer presents him with the incriminating evidence that clearly implicates Aaron Wright and Nguyen as being involved in an illegal conspiracy. Instead of immediately acting on it, he says that he needs to confirm this first, and he goes to Cotillard very publicly, and thus Nguyen is alerted to the fact that Souther is onto him and takes steps to counter that, whereas had he not gone to Cotillard and instead immediately took steps to remove Nguyen from command, he would have been more successful and probably wouldn't have died. Now, although in the novel Souther didn't fall victim to the same mistake, it is in keeping with his character, because in the novel Souther was on Avasarala's side the whole time, but he refused to act on it until actually ordered to do so by Secretary General Gillis. In other words, he needed to have the law on his side first, which is exactly how Souther is behaving in this scene, rather than doing what's right first and then sorting out the law later, as some more heroic figures would do, like Miller and arguably even Holden as well. So ultimately, I thought this was a brilliant way to stay true to the nature of Souther's character while mixing it up in a way that ramped up the tension and was more in line with the story that the show developed, so I'm going to give this a +4. So we then go back to the Versanote, where we see Holden in the armory tweaking the armor when Naomi comes in and gives him a status update on how they are approaching Io, which is getting crowded, but Alex is still managing to slip by undetected. Naomi then turns the situation more personal and basically apologizes to him for hurting him by giving the protomolecule to Fred Johnson. She doesn't regret giving the protomolecule to the belt, but she regrets the way that she did it, saying that she should have trusted and included Holden and what he thinks does matter to her. She then confesses that she used to be in love with a man who was a fanatic, who believed what he was doing was truly right no matter how many people he hurt, and whom she had a baby with named Philip. And eventually this man took the baby away from her because she refused to follow his violent fanaticism, which made her numb to the world, and it was partly why she joined the Canterbury. But when she saw Belters dying by the thousands on Eros and Ganymede, she wasn't numb anymore, and it made her picture that Philip was amongst them, and so it spurred her to act, which she did without thinking how it would impact Holden. Holden tells her that he'll never be happy with what she did, but he can't hate her for doing what she thought was right. So this is the beginning of Holden and Naomi's reconciliation, which in the novels the two of them were never at odds with each other, at least not to this extreme and not in this part of the story. So needless to say, None of this was in the novels. However, the fact about Naomi having a son named Philip who was taken from her is from the novels, but it's not revealed until book 5. And so Naomi never confessed this to Holden the way she does here, and I thought this was a brilliant way to flesh out her motivations for giving the protomolecule to the belt, while being in keeping with how her character was portrayed in the novels. And the big thing here is that in the novels, this information about Naomi's son came out of nowhere. And if I'm being completely honest, it felt a bit like a retcon, where the show is doing a much better job of setting up for this by revealing it early. And this, by the way, isn't the first time Naomi's son was mentioned on the show. As I discussed earlier, it was brought up before in Season 2 when Naomi was talking to Prax. But this is the first time she tells Holden about it, and she does go into a bit more detail here. So I love this character development. I think this fleshes out Naomi's character much more than it was in the novels at this stage, so I'm going to give this a +3. So then we go over to Io, where Dr. Strickland and Jules Pierre Mal are trying to get more information out of Katoa. Mal asks him about the work, and Katoa simply responds by saying, "Soon the work will be finished." Katoa keeps yelling that and eventually goes berserk, breaking through his constraints. Strickland and Mal evacuate the room and then sedate him. Mal muses on how the protomolecule has an objective, one which it's close to accomplishing, so Mal now believes it's imperative that they find out what it is. But Strickland informs him that they could slow Katoa's transformation but not stop it, and unfortunately Katoa has surpassed the point of being able to communicate with them and soon will have no vocal cords. So Mal tells him they need to start the transformation with another child so they can get this information which could save humanity. And Strickland says out of all the children remaining, the one that shows the most promise in being able to transform the quickest is Mei Ming. And so Mal orders him to make it happen, which shows how much Mal thinks it's important that because he's actually grown close to Mei, but he still orders her to be turned into a monster. Now, again, nothing like this happened in the novels. We never got an ominous warning about how the work will be finished soon, but I think it helps the story so much by having this in there. First of all, this scene was creepy as hell, and secondly, it does a much better job than the novels did at reminding the audience of the looming threat over Venus, so I'm going to give this a +4. So then the Agatha King arrives in orbit of Io, and Admiral Nguyen contacts Jules Pierre Mal to inform him that his family has been freed and his accounts have been unfrozen, and in return he needs to turn over control of the protomolecule hybrids and all material involved in the project. Mal seems shaken by this, but he agrees. Then Admiral Souther is brought to the CIC and brought to Admiral Nguyen. Souther uses Nguyen's first name and tries to reason with him, but Nguyen just interrupts him and tells him that he's relieved of duty and confined to quarters, and if he tries anything else, he'll put him in irons. However, the thought is interrupted by Mancuso reporting that the MCRN Himurabi is approaching and will soon be in weapons range. So Nguyen abandons Souther to take command and orders everyone to their battle stations. So in the novels, we never see Admiral Nguyen and his fleet take control of the protomolecule hybrids and learn that it's pretty much already happened. And as I already mentioned, Souther and Nguyen were on different ships, and Nguyen had no more authority than Souther did, so he never relieved him of command. But when Souther and his fleet arrived alongside the Martian fleet, Nguyen sent out a transmission calling for Admiral Souther. He's calling Admiral Souther's actions illegal and orders that the ships in his fleet disperse and that Souther be placed under arrest. But Souther interrupted his transmission by saying, "Oh, do shut up," and said that he and his fleet were under the legal orders of Secretary General Gillis to investigate an illegal operation involving illegal bioweapons And then, he went on and on. Honestly, I like both scenarios. I think they are both equally effective in ramping up the tension, so I'm going to give this a 0. So then we go over to the Himurabi, where we see Captain Crenito informed that they are approaching the Agatha King, and she orders the ship to slow their approach. Her XO, Lieutenant Durant, objects, but then realizes that Crenito sent Admiral Southard the message from Ehrenreich. When she confirms it, he warns her what it could be considered, but she brushes those concerns aside, saying that they have two huge fleets bearing down on each other, which the only inevitable outcome is mutual destruction, and then explains that war is usually caused by politics, and that perhaps out here, away from all the politicians, that message from Ehrenreich may allow them to find a way to stop all this bloodshed. Durant seems unconvinced and says, well, that's all good and noble, but if there is a shooting fight, he'd prefer to win it. So as I mentioned before, these characters weren't in the novels. We never saw from the MCRN's perspective, but we had a similar situation with two huge fleets bearing down on each other. In fact, Holden referred to it as the largest ship engagement in history, saying that there had never been that many ships gathered in one place for a battle, and I do believe in the books there were way more ships than there are here in the show. However, in that case, it made a bit more sense as the two fleets were colliding over Io because of the proto-molecule, whereas here, the Martians have no idea why the UNN fleet is going to Io, but I do really love the inclusion of the Martian perspective. Plus, this Captain Crenito character is a very intelligent and dynamic character who doesn't fit into the stereotypical MCRN military leader who's all about war and shooting stuffs, which have been portrayed in the show, which admittedly is more of what Lieutenant Durant is like. But Crenito is smart enough to want to avoid a battle if they can, and this is great as it's an extra nice added ingredient into the situation and sets up nice for this outcome to happen. But it also adds a lot of dynamic and character to it, so I'm going to give this a +3. So then we go back to the Versanote as it approaches Io. Everyone prepares for landing as the Versanote descends on Io. Draper is in her battle armor, bracing herself, and Amos tries to reassure Prax that they'll find May, and if they don't, he needs to be prepared, but he says that he is. On Io, we see Jules Pierre Mal and Dr. Strickland in the room with May as she's strapped down as they're about to do the procedure to turn her into a protomolecule hybrid. However, the sound of the Versanote landing scares them as they wonder who's approaching, and they stop. Outside, we see Draper, Holden, Amos, and Prax approach the compound as they prepare to breach it. So in the novels, when the Versanote approached Io, they first had to deal with the huge ship battle as being part of the joint fleet between the MCRN forces and Admiral Southard's forces. In fact, Avasarala is coordinating the political portion of that fleet. It isn't until after the situation is dealt with, that is, after Nguyen's fleet is defeated and the Agatha King is infected with the protomolecule and the hybrids are launched towards Mars, that the Versanote lands on Io, and then they attempt to rescue May. Also in the novels, it's just Draper, Prax, and Amos who attempt to breach the compound on Io. Before the Versanote lands on Io, Holden takes the Razorback over to the Agatha King to retrieve the abort codes for the hybrids, but I'll cover that in the next episode. Suffice to say, here I prefer the book's version of events. As much as I love moving the conflict between Southern and Nguyen to the same ship, I thought the Versanote crew was a casualty of this move, as they are less involved and thus given less to do. Particularly Avasarala, as I mentioned before, had a major role to play in the conflict, but here she's demoted to a background character who just makes commentary every now and again. As for Jules Pierre Mal and Strickland about to turn May into a protomolecule hybrid, this does not happen in the novels either. As I mentioned earlier, Mal isn't there, but also it's implied that Strickland purposely left May untouched so that he could use her as a bargaining chip. ship, as in the novels there was a huge public GoFundMe campaign to help Prax find his daughter, and thus Prax and May became celebrities. So Strickland knew that he could use May to gain his freedom should he ever be caught, so he purposely left her untouched. However, as I mentioned, I'm not a huge fan of how the Versanote crew and Avasarala in particular were sidelined in this story, so I'm going to give this a -4. So on the Agatha King, we see that the Himurabi is in firing range of the Agatha King and still doesn't fire. On the Himurabi, we see Cronino ask Napoli about Avasarala and what she was like, and he said that he thought he liked her, and that made Cronino smile, while Duran asked her again if they should fire on the Agatha King, and again she said no. On the Agatha King, we see Nguyen puzzled on why the Himurabi hasn't fired on them, and Souther says that they're testing them to see if they're honorable, to which Nguyen replies by saying that there's no honor in defeat, and then orders that they fire on the Himurabi. That's when Souther countermands the order and takes control of the ship, and his supporters are quick to respond, drawing their weapons on Nguyen and his men. Souther then orders that they open a channel to all ships in the area, Earth and Mars. Souther then announces that he's relieved Admiral Nguyen of command on charges of conspiracy and orders all ships to stand down. However, Nguyen's men take advantage of the distraction to attack and disarm Souther's people, and in the process, Nguyen draws his own weapon and kills Admiral Souther. So in the novels, Admiral Souther does not die at this stage, and in fact he's alive and well and makes a reappearance in Book 6. As I mentioned, he was on his own ship and controlling the quarantine on the Agatha King after it was infected by the protomolecule, and a mutiny did not take place on the Agatha King that involved Souther. But what happened was, when the two fleets approached each other, there was a lot of posturing, but then a message came in from Earth from Secretary General Gillis ordering several key people in Nguyen's fleet, including Nguyen himself, to immediately return to Earth for questioning involving the investigation of an illegal weapons conspiracy. And that's when Nguyen realized that Ehrenreich had made a deal with Gillis and had sold Nguyen out. And he didn't take too kindly to this, and in return started shooting at Souther's forces. While Avasarala contacted the ships trying to find out who was on which side, some of the ships reported infighting. One ship had its captain relieved of duty so that they could comply with Souther's orders, while another ship, when Avasarala contacted them, all she could hear was men shouting at each other. So it was all bedlam, similar to what we see in this scene. And as much as I love the big space battle, I think seeing it play out in person at one location in a mutiny fashion rather than people on ships talking to each other over the radio was much more exciting. Plus, killing Souther really upped the stakes and showed him as a flawed man, as he should have acted, and he paid for it with his life and the lives of his supporters. Super intense, so I'm going to give this a +5. So after Souther has been killed, Nguyen is back in command, and he told that the fleet is retreating. He then orders the fleet to return and prepare to engage the Martian fleet. Two of the ships don't respond to his orders and continue to retreat. Nguyen then orders the weapons station to target lock one of the UN ships that's retreating. She refuses, raising her hands and backing away from the station. Nguyen physically throws her out of her chair and then announces that anyone who is unwilling to follow his lawful orders should declare themselves now, and several people raise their hands and step forward, and Nguyen orders that they be taken to the brig. He then sits at the weapons station and target locks the ship, and then sends a message to them ordering him to return to the fleet or be fired upon. They refuse to change course, so he fires on them, destroying them. Now, in the novels, it's kind of similar, as Nguyen does order Souther ships to stand down, and when they don't, he fires on them. But of course, in this case, it's just one fleet, whereas in the novels there's two fleets loyal to their particular admirals. But as I just mentioned, there was still dissent amongst the individual crews. When watching this episode, I found it odd how easy Nguyen destroyed the UN ship, as it didn't defend itself with PDCs, but the novels might have an answer for this. As in the novel, several UN ships were easily destroyed because its defense systems didn't recognize UN weapons as hostile and thus wasn't programmed to defend against them, so the PDCs didn't even come on, and the missiles simply destroyed the ships without any resistance. That's something that Avasarala had to tell Souther to correct immediately to prevent any more ships from being destroyed. So I'm sure that's also the case here. It just wasn't explained here like it was in the books. But still, this was an absolutely intense and amazing scene showing the discord amongst Souther's crew and how shocked even Nguyen's supporters were at him ordering the destruction of another UN ship. Added a really rich dynamic that wasn't there in the novel, so I'm going to give this a +5. After it's reported that the UN ship has been destroyed, Mancuso and Schaefer use the distraction to attack Nguyen's guards. A struggle ensues, one in which Mancuso loses and is shot and killed. Schaefer, however, wins her struggle and wrestles the gun out of Nguyen's man. When Boyer tries to attack her, she kills him by snapping his neck, and then shoots and kills another one of Nguyen's men, and then she shoots Nguyen himself. However, she fails to kill him, and he shoots back at her, critically injuring her. Meanwhile, several UN ships fire at the Agatha King, which its PDC defenses comes on and defends itself against these attacks. Now, this was a super intense scene. Other than those communiques from Avasarala that I already mentioned, there was really nothing like this in the books, or at least we weren't as up and close and personal. It was like the movie Crimson Tide, but much more violent, and the way people kept dying had a gritty sense of realism to it and was far more intense than anything in the novels, so I'm going to give this a +5. On board the Himurabi, Captain Crenito and Ensign Snopely watch in shock as all the UN ships begin attacking each other. Durant suggests that they fire on the UN ships, but Crenito says no. She then sends a message to her fleet ordering all MCRN ships to stand down and reports that there has been a mutiny on the Agatha King and the UN ships are now firing on each other, and if they fire at them, that will only unite them against the Martians, so she says if they want to destroy themselves, we should let them. So she's smart. I love this captain. I do feel they are lucky that a hothead didn't so happen to be in charge of the MCRN fleet, but I suppose it shows that there's also honorable people on both sides of the conflict. And her reasoning that she gives to the Martians makes sense, that why risk uniting them against them when they can just let them destroy themselves. But as we soon see, that wasn't her true intention, but it was sound logic that the MCRN would not fight back against. Now, in the novels, we never got this because the MCRN were already allied with Souther's fleet, but they did ask Avasarala for permission on which UN ships they were allowed to attack. Also, the Martian in command of the fleet was a bit of a hothead, because when the combined fleet first approached Io, a message from Io warned that if they didn't leave, that they would send the missiles with biological weapons to Mars, and the Martian fleet commander responded by saying that if anything as large as a bottle rocket was launched from Io, they would scuttle the entire moon. Kind of an understandable response, but it did nothing to calm the tensions. Anyway, I absolutely love this scene and the rich dynamic involved, so I'm going to give this a +5. So back on the Agatha King, we see Schaefer severely injured, trying to crawl away, but Admiral Nguyen, who was injured himself, shoots her twice, killing her. A message then comes in from the Himurabi. It's Cronino, and she tells the UN fleet that any ship that identifies itself as not hostile will not be fired upon, and further will be rendered. She will render assistance to these ships if they need it. In other words, they're basically joining forces with them, meaning Nguyen now knows that he's outnumbered and is in a losing battle. When his officer asks for orders, Nguyen ignores him and goes to the console where Mal gave him control of the protomolecule hybrids. And with a sick, twisted smile on his face, he launches the hybrids towards Mars. Now, in the books, the Martian joining forces with the UN ships that opposed him is not what set Admiral Nguyen off, as Suther's fleet had already joined with the MCRN, and they came with a fleet twice his size. Nguyen just banks on Suther's fleet backing down. But even after fighting breaks out, Nguyen refuses to back down. However, Avasarala sends a message as the representative of the civilian government on Earth and orders all ships supporting Nguyen to back down, and then Souther offers amnesty to any ship captain that backs down now, but if they refuse to do so now, they will be considered outlaws and fired upon. And eventually, all of Nguyen's allies either back down or are destroyed, and the Agatha King is the only ship left remaining. That's when Admiral Nguyen launches the protomolecule hybrids towards Mars after he already knows that he's lost. And you get the impression that he did it out of pettiness rather than a hate-filled revenge lust as it is in the show. So I find the show's version much more powerful, as that evil look on Nguyen's face as he does it is absolutely priceless. So I'm going to give this a +5. So on Io, we see Holden and his crew as Amos tries to break into Mal's compound, which is locked. Amos finally breaks through one layer, but they are interrupted by a loud sound as they watch dozens of missiles launch from the surface, and they all look in horror. And Holden says what they're all thinking, that they've launched the hybrids. So in the novels, Mal's compound wasn't actually locked. All they had to do was go up to the door and open it to go inside. In fact, Amos noted how no one would bother locking their doors on Io because there's no point. No one lives there, and it's a very hostile environment, so few people would actually go there. And as far as the hybrids being launched, in the novels, they were all on the Versanote when it happened, and it's a book, so you couldn't see the look of horror on their faces, but they didn't seem as horrified as they do here, but that's probably because they're described as being more involved in their duties and kind of blocking everything out when they're working. But it does add a lot to see the look of horror on their faces when the hybrids are launched, particularly Bobby Draper, whose actor did an amazing job here. So I'm going to give this a +2. So my final adaptation score for Triple Point is a +45. One of the highest scores I've ever given, my second highest, I believe, which doesn't surprise me since this is my second favorite episode of the show. As much as I love what they did with the conflict in the novels, I thought the show brought it to a whole new level with the mutiny storyline, as it really fleshed out Southern Nguyen and made them feel real, as well as inventing characters like their lieutenants and the Martian captain, who really added to the texture of everything, making this a much more intense and exciting version of the story that was already amazing. So it really surpassed the books in this instance. So that's it for my book-to-show comparison for The Expanse Season 3, Episode 5. I'll be back in just a few days for my comparison for Episode 6, so be sure to keep an eye out for that, as well as many other videos on The Expanse, and many videos on other shows like Star Trek, Lost, and more, so be sure to subscribe so you can keep up with all of that, and thanks a lot for watching.